Leavens. Thanks for joining us. I was hoping to get started with a few questions.
Sure.
So, my first question for you is, could you provide a brief description of your work with the experimental prairie plots?
Sure. So I take care of an experimental prairie that is composed of 437 2 meter by 2 meter square plots. So 437 small gardens, and they vary in a number of ways. So 254 of them are monocultures, meaning they were established with only one species. So if the experiment were ideal, all of those plots are only home to one plant species, and there's many individuals of those living in that plot. Of course, there are weeds because we're in a natural environment, but for the most part, those monocultures just have one species, and there are 127 prairie species that were introduced to the experiment. So each of those has two monoculture plots. The other plots are what are called polycultures, meaning that there's multiple species living in them. And each of the polycultures was established with 15 species. And those 15 species vary in a couple of different ways. So there are different combinations of 15 species, all pulled from that list of 127. And some of those combinations are relatively similar in their physical characteristics. So we call it functional diversity because it relates to how the plant is functioning, right? So some plants have really big leaves, some have smaller leaves, some are tall, some are short, big flowered, small flowered, and all of those things impact how it interacts with the environment, who pollinates it, how it might live next to another plant with similar or different characteristics. And so we call that functional diversity, but the plots vary in sort of their functional diversity levels. So some of those 15 species combinations are really similar in their characteristics, and some are more different in their characteristics. And the hope in that is that we get a sense of how species live together and how those communities change over time based on how different or similar their characteristics are, how much those characteristics complement each other or don't. The other way in which the plots vary is what we call phylogenetic diversity, which is just a measure of the relatedness of the species. So you could have 15 species that are very closely related. They could be 5 roses, 5 mints, and 5 sunflowers, or they could all be from different families. And the latter would have what's called higher phylogenetic diversity, which is just a higher representation of the tree of life. So different parts of the sort of evolutionary tree that is better represented by those 15 species that are all from different families than the first group with just 3 different families that are living together. And so again, we're looking at how do these plant communities sort of change over time and establish over time if they are more closely related or more distantly related from each other. And then the actually third factor by which they vary is that, or fourth, I suppose, is that some of those polycultures, half of those polycultures were established by seed and the other half by plug. And that is looking at how, really seeing how would these communities that vary establish over time if they were first introduced with seed, which is most likely how prairie managers are going to be introducing or establishing prairie restoration. And then the other gives us an opportunity to see how do individuals that have already gotten a head start and are more established, how do those interact over time? So it gives us a sort of an added comparison because those different methods could have really different impacts. We don't know, and that's part of what we're trying to find out.
What do you think is the most important thing people should know about gardening with native plants?
I think planting a diversity is really key because native plants didn't evolve to live alone, right? And that's something we see in our experiment is that a lot of the monocultures don't do that well, which is of course they don't do that well. These plants evolved to live in community, filling those different niches and having their other species friends, right? Filling other niches. And so I think aiming for diversity is the best way to like respect their culture, right? The culture and kind of dynamics of how those plants live healthy lives. Um, and the other thing I would say is like, just if you do get to have a native garden, like try to spend time making observations in it, because I think one wonderful thing about having a native garden is like a lot of other organisms come to make use of it oftentimes. And I think that speaks for itself, right? Like it speaks to the virtue of having native plants and a native garden and having them together.